Anyone who knows me knows just how much I love the Chinese Room, a small development company who have been behind some of the most impactful games of the last decade and a half, at least for me personally. So when their latest game was ported for consoles and PC, I just had to take a look and see if they kept up the amazing quality of previous games. Random side note, the studio's name derives from a philosophical argument that no computer executing a program can ever have a true mind or consciousness. This is a thought experiment that software developers continue to push the limits of to this day. Not hugely relevant to this specific game, but interesting nonetheless. So on to today's review. Little Orpheus was originally released for mobile gaming 2 years ago. I'm not a huge fan personally of mobile gaming just because of, space on my phone and also the size of the screen, so I didn't play it when it first came out. Luckily for me, this month it was finally released onto all other gaming platforms, much to the excitement of myself. It has previously been delayed due to the setting of the game and its relation to the ongoing crisis in Ukraine, so it's nice to see that it's finally managed to make its debut. The game is a Technicolor side-scrolling adventure game that uses platforms and puzzles to tell the most unusual of stories. It takes inspiration from films like The Land That Time Forgot and other multimedia stories like Greek mythology to tell a story of a rather unusual hero. The game opens with a black and white screen showing the interrogation of one Ivan Ivanovich by a Soviet general. He is being questioned about the whereabouts of a nuclear bomb that was in his keeping called Little Orpheus. Ivanovich is a cosmonaut at the time when Soviet Russia was attempting to put a man in space. However, rather than going up, Ivanovich was tasked with going the opposite direction and discovering what was below the surface of the Earth. He's not seen again until 3 years later when he turns up with a truly remarkable story of what he found at the Earth's core. This is a spoiler-free review, so I won't go too much into detail about the plot from there, but safe to say this is a quirky and unique little story with an unusual protagonist at its centre. Ivanovich defies all odds to aid a lost world that is threatened by a nuclear disaster and villainous designs with the meaning of time at their centre. The plot has clearly been developed on the shoulders of in-depth research into popular media and stories from the time. This includes a city from a 1915 sci-fi novel and humanoid creatures from Siberian folklore. It was quite fun to go away and look up many of the references that were made and link them to the way the characters reacted to their discovery. I thoroughly enjoyed the game's story, which was heartwarming as well as funny, with little quips from the general as Ivanovich narrates the story whilst you play. Which leads me on to sound. The game has an unusually attentive soundscape, whereby navigating the different spaces will trigger the next section of a narrative. They have been perfectly timed in places in order to start and stop at appropriate points that just feel perfectly natural as you play. It also has a gorgeous soundtrack, which is something we have come to expect from Chinese Room games, including a return of composer Jessica Curry, who wrote my all-time favourite game soundtrack for Everybody's Gone to the Rapture. She works alongside Jim Fowler to produce a fun and refreshing composition. I particularly liked the following part of the soundtrack, which was for a section where you were sneaking past a T-Rex using an egg as a disguise. As you can see, the soundtrack follows your lead as you sneak, which is just a lovely little extra to the game's quirky style and just made me smile as I was playing. That being said, I did have a few issues with the sound not lining up in cutscenes to the action playing out. Mouth animations would occasionally be out of sync with the audio, which was a shame and should really have been rectified because it detracts from the overall strong effect the sound was meant to have. It's a small thing, but very irritating for the player. Moving on, this was a very different game than those from the Chinese Room that I have spoken about before. As I mentioned, it is a side-scrolling platformer which is worlds away from the story-focused walking simulators of their past. Dan Pinchbeck, the creative director, said when they were developing Little Orpheus that he wanted to apply the Chinese Room's art house background to traditional genres moving forward. This is most likely due to the fact that the Chinese room was all but lost in 2017 due to a lack of funds, and they actually had to let their entire staff go. Eventually, a year later, they were sold to Sumo Digital, and it sounds like the studio needs to pull in a wider audience now than walking simulators would allow, and this is their first foray into perhaps a change of direction for the team, which is now bigger than ever. Whilst I do understand the fact studios and dev teams have to adapt constantly to changing markets and consumer needs, I will say that I was disappointed in some aspects of the shift in the Chinese room style. Whilst, like I said, I enjoyed the story, which is told over 8 chapters in a standalone epilogue, I felt the game's mechanics and desperation to be a game left the story a little stilted and confined to a game mechanic structure rather than the free-flowing form that its previous games were praised for. If you've watched any of my other videos, you'll know that I did a whole video about Everybody's Gone to the Rapture, what it actually means, what the ending means. This isn't something that you're going to necessarily get from Little Orpheus. The game has very simple mechanics, and even a newbie gamer will quickly master its needs. I spent maybe 4 or 5 hours playing the game, which is doubled if you then go back and replay the chapters to find added collectibles and unlock rewards. I quite like this way of including collectibles, as it means you can focus on the story the first time around before going back and keeping your eyes peeled for glowing orbs. The game costs £9.99 in Great British pounds, which isn't a lot and would be appropriate, I think, for the length and style of this game. I think it's been perfectly priced, if I'm honest, and it's one that you could maybe replay in a few months if you just fancied some casual gaming. Ultimately, this is a fun little adventure game to play as the days get colder in the Northern Hemisphere, but doesn't leave the same lasting memory as earlier games in the Chinese room's portfolio. Strong sound and voice acting do somewhat make up for the oversimplified core game mechanics that hold the game back, but don't completely erase them. The studio is already in development of their next game, although no more information has been released at this time. I selfishly do hope they go back to what made the previously independent studio great, but only time will tell, something Ivan Ivanovich knows all too well.